Good breakfast. Good breakfast.
Everyone seems keen to start. I think we have another minute. Is that on? Yeah. Make sure late students can come in. Well, good morning and welcome back. My name is Hannah Andre, and I'm Assistant Professor of Church History here at North Park. And here for our second session to wake our brains up, if they're not already awake, is Gerald Cleaver, Professor, Graduate Program Director, Department of Physics and Center for Astrophysics, Space Physics, and Engineering Research at Baylor University with his paper, Multiverse, Philosophical and Theological Perspectives. And to respond, we have Stephen Ray, Assistant Professor of Physics and Engineering and Director of Sustainability here at North Park University. And before we begin the paper, one announcement for those joining us from online. If you do wish to participate in discussion throughout the lecture and also join for question and answer, which you're able to do through our moderator, please be sure that you're actually logged in. You won't be able to join the discussion unless you log in, which requires creating an account. So without further ado, pass it on to Professor Cleaver.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here. It's an honor to participate in this workshop. And I am an early universe cosmologist, but I'm also very interested in the overlap of science and theology. And for me, studying the universe at the very beginning has theological implications. In particular, when we deal with things that are cutting-edge science, such as multiverse. It does indeed have philosophical and theological perspectives and implications. I'm going to address those at the same time, delving directly with some theological issues. And that is a very fundamental theological issue of what is the nature of God as creator in terms of relationship with creation. And that brings up the issue of concepts such as divine will and free will. What does cutting-edge cosmology say about that? And that's what I want to try to address in my talk today, an examination of multiverse. One of the issues with various positions is the relationship between the divine will of the Creator and the freedom of the natural world and the free will of human beings. This continues to be debated and has been for hundreds of years. Scripture, tradition, and theology actually provide no clear answer to this debate because the divine will, free will dichotomy has opposing sides that always claim scriptural support for their views. In 2006, there was a survey conducted by the Institute for Studies of Religion at my university, Baylor, and the survey was funded by the John Templeton Foundation. It revealed that 54% of Americans believe that God is, quote, engaged in every creature's life and world affairs, while alternately, 46% believe that God does not generally intervene within his creation, the life of Christ being the most acknowledged exception, along with other possible biblical events. But generally, it's about 50-50 split between those that believe that God, as creator, is active versus is non-active. And so, and Christians are closely divided between the two categories, with fundamentalists and evangelicals believing predominantly in an interventionist God, and members of mainline Protestant churches and Catholics believing predominantly in a non-interventionist God. And among those who believe in the interventionist God, 57% view God as simultaneously angry at humanity's sins and ready to throw the thunderbolt of judgment down on the unfaithful or ungodly, versus 43% perceive God primarily as forgiving. And among those who believe in a primarily non-interventionist God, 45% of this group also view God as critical, whereas 55% perceive God as distant, like a cosmic force, or disengaged, as in deism. Some people's views actually can overlap both categories. They believe in a God who acts within creation while carrying out his will purely, or at least primarily, through processes obeying the physical laws of the universe. And this is how my cosmological studies fit in. God is then understood, in this view, one position is that God is understood as primary cause, while the physical laws are deemed secondary cause. This is a concept that's gone around for quite a while. God, transcendent to space-time, is understood to provide room for himself to act in our universe within the uncertainties of quantum mechanics and at a more classical level through chaos theory, or according to physical laws beyond ours. Ian Barber and John Polkinghorne are proponents of this view. I would place myself essentially within the non-interventionist group, accepting where God may act transcendentally as primary cause for divine special purpose through quantum mechanical uncertainties and is realized in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Further, divine primary cause actively may be, by its own very nature, essentially impossible to identify. And this relates to the Lutheran concept of the hiddenness of God. Some people's views may overlap both categories, believing in a God who acts within creation while carrying out his will purely, or at least primarily, through processes obeying the physical laws of the universe. And that's what I'm going to get to within multiverse studies, and showing how, in fact, one can perceive a duality between God acting transcendentally and God acting inherently. At the same time, as we know, that strong tension has existed between science and theology within the U.S. for 120 years. And it's at the same time of those other surveys taken. Recent surveys have shown that nearly 1/3 of young adults with a Christian background believe that, quote, churches are out of step with the scientific world we live in. And 1/4 of the young adults today believe that Christianity is non-science. I'm not saying that's true, but this is the opinions that these percent view. And is telling, a recent survey conducted by the Associated Press, GfK, of over 1,000 U.S. adults indicates that Americans have more doubt than acceptance of concepts that scientists accept as firmly established by overwhelming evidence. In particular, the Big Bang, the 13.8 billion year age of the universe, the 4.5 billion year age of Earth, and the 3.5 billion year evolution of life on Earth are disbelieved by 51% of the U.S. citizens population. Only about 21% of Americans are confident or extremely confident that our universe began with the Big Bang 14 billion years ago. This was revealed by Bornstein and Agester in 2014. Tellingly, acceptance of scientific conclusions strongly supported by evidence decreases sharply with increasing theistic belief. Here in the U.S., evangelical and fundamentalist Christians in particular express much doubt. This is based on Kinningham et al. In 2011. So the message that I want to make to people, especially within the churches, is that a reunification of faith and science within the Christian community is deeply needed. A theology of nature, as coined by Barber, is clearly fundamental to these issues. From studies of the natural world, we can gain knowledge about the processes through which the transcendent God acts with and within creation. Scientific knowledge can contribute significantly to deeper theological understandings of God's interaction. I think it's time for a renaissance of a consistent theology of nature, welcomed and supported within more Protestant churches. And I think perception of the nature and modes of God's transcendent interaction with creation has advanced significantly over millennia through growing understanding of the natural world. I'm going to present these steps in terms of what I'll define as paradigms of creation. Significant steps in theological aspects have often correlated strongly with these paradigm shifts in our understanding of the physical world. With each upward paradigm shift of understanding physical creation, it has simultaneously promoted growth in theological perception of nature's creator. Each paradigm advancement has shed brighter light on the general methods by which and through which the Creator interacts with all of creation. one of the first paradigms of creation that I think we're familiar with in these 5 to 6 paradigm shifts is the Old Testament view, not just Old Testament, but Mid-Eastern view of, and there was some mention of this yesterday in some conversation, of the 3-tier paradigm of the ancient Mideast world. And I would describe this as prehistory to about 300 BC to 1st century AD in the Mideast. And this was the paradigm in which not just the Jewish community, but the whole Mid-Eastern society viewed creation. The 3-tier process of the intermediate land of the earth, the heavens above, and the underworld land of the dead below. And surrounded by the primeval oceans, both at and above. And this was the view of creation that is really needed to understand and to interpret Genesis and much of the Old Testament, even some of the New Testament, to fully place herself in the societal views of the writers of it. And again, this was good. This lasted till about 300 BC, in which from 300 BC to about the 1600s, the dominant creation paradigm was the geocentric view, devised first in the Greco-Roman period all the way until the 1600s. And this was the longest lasting paradigm that the world has been in. And this was, again, Earth as the center, surrounding planets, sun remaining. Then, by the time of the 1600s to the 1700s, with the dawn of modern science, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton and all, we entered the heliocentric paradigm. From the 1600s to the 1700s, the sun was the center of known creation, with the planets and eventually Mercury, Venus, Earth, all the way out to Jupiter and Saturn. This was one of the shorter paradigms. It was basically good only for a little over 100 years, because by the 1800s to the 1920s, that ours was not the only sun, that all of the stars were basically like ours. We entered the galactocentric paradigm, as I'll call it, from the 1800s to the 1920s. And this was the idea that the entire universe was formed, of the composition of a single galaxy, our Milky Way. And even as Einstein as he worked on special and general relativity, he perceived the universe as to be composed solely of our Milky Way galaxy. That space itself was pretty small. Those are big distances, but in terms of vast scales, it was still pretty small. How small are we talking? I guess for me, relativistically, it is small, but the galaxy itself, we are talking about something that is 100,000 light years in diameter and about 10,000 light years in thickness up. How big is a light year? A light year is about 600 trillion miles. Pretty big. And if you go on from that, the whole universe we now know is vastly larger than just a single galaxy. By the 1920s, mid-1920s, several people, including Hubble and all, showed that the Milky Way galaxy was not the only one. Nebulous clouds perceived to be in our galaxy were actually other galaxies vast distances away. Until the time where we've reached we now understand that we exist in a full universe, in the observable region of the universe alone. Again, it's the perceived part that we can see. The observed region of the universe is 13.8 billion years old. That means the earliest stuff that we are seeing. We see the most distant galaxies as they were, basically, I'm going to round it off and just say 14 billion years ago. That means they've already been traveling, since we're seeing them, they've traveled for another 14 billion years, which means what we're actually seeing now, that's total diameter distance scale of the observable universe, is 14 times 2, 28 billion. But actually, the universe has been accelerating in expansion, so it's actually bigger than that. The estimation now is that the observable universe spans a distance scale of about 14 billion light years. And again, one light year is 6 trillion, I said 600, but it's 6 trillion miles. So the distance scale of the observable universe is 6 trillion times 14 billion. So we are talking basically 20 billion trillion miles for the scale of the observable universe now. And this presents the universe-centric picture that I'll say. And within now, this is not actually a picture. This is a computer generation based on extensions of observable galaxies near us. But we actually see patterns here. I won't focus on these, but you can see that there are lines. There is structure to the universe itself. And within all of the observable universe, there is patterns, and it doesn't change throughout the whole thing. And no, it's not a cube either, but I just have this in to give in a sense of depth. But this is what it's like, and the universe-centric picture. And we've had this from the 1920s, and then I have a question mark, basically into the 21st century, and how far, we don't know. Because we're actually, for quite a while, about 3 decades, we've had the idea that this can't be, even this can't be everything. One is the pattern. There's no reason to expect that beyond the observable universe, it's not a continuation of what we see within the observable. There's no reason why it ends within what we can see. That's, if it was, that would be giving us some special position within our own observable galaxy or universe, and we shouldn't. We're going to go with Copernican logic that where we are is typical of where it is elsewhere, and that this extends beyond the observable universe to say outside the observable should be more of what we do see. So we know right off, logically, that our universe is not just composed of the observable region. The observable region is also known as the Hubble volume, and I'll make reference to call it by that name in a little bit too. But what does come beyond? First, the non-observable universe. And then, what are the boundaries of that? Should there be boundaries? Would we expect there to be boundaries? And the answer to that is, in the simplest geometry, not likely. We would expect there to be no boundaries to the physical extensions of our observable universe. And then that defines what is often called a level 1 multiverse. A level 1 multiverse is simply an infinite extension of a given universe. And a multiverse, level 1, is a connected region in which the same physical laws rule everywhere. That simple extension of infinite universe or level 1 multiverse. And that's what we typically exist in, is firmly supported by the physics that we find in our own universe. That there's not just a boundary that the rules stop where we see the universe stopping, but that the rules should go on. And the same thing fits in with our understanding of the origin of our universe through a Big Bang inflation process. We understand the history of our universe very well over the 14 billion year history. We can go back as early as about 10 to the minus 40th of a second, which is when the universe gets into the Planck scale phase, when the size of the observable universe, I always want to emphasize observable universe, was around 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. That is 10 to the minus 20 times smaller than the size of a hydrogen atom, of the nucleus. So we're talking really small, but that is at the point in which the physics that we know breaks down. So we cannot generally go back further than 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 40th of a second or so. And then that is at the point where current cosmology is asking what came before. And the general answer is likely our universe, through the Big Bang inflation process, came from something more fundamental, the multiverse as a whole. And basically what we think of it as coming from something that we use the real scientific name space-time soup. That basically the situation of the overall physics that allows for inflation of a single universe is much like the analogy of a boiling pot of water. When water reaches the boiling stage, what do you expect? Do you expect to see just one air bubble form within and nothing else the whole time you're watching a pot of water at boiling temperature? No, you see a series of bubbles for the whole time that the water exists and before it's all burnt up. And the same thing is a lot like this, the inflationary stage that can explain one universe basically implies a whole vast series of universes going through Big Bang inflation stages. It is very improbable. It takes a lot of fine-tuning in the underlying physics, no matter what you're assuming, to create the physics situation that allows for inflation that our universe went through. To not yield any other it would take extreme fine-tuning to produce that, just like it would take extreme fine-tuning to produce a boiling pot of water that only allows one bubble forming from it. And so you don't expect that. And it's the same thing. This is one of the dominant reasons that current cosmology predicts something like a multiverse. What the multiverse is like is not determined, and there's a lot of freedom in that. And that's where the different types of multiverses come along. And classification of these multiverses was done by Max Tegmark at Chicago. And he goes through and defines multiverses based on level definitions. Level 1 multiverse is, like I said before, level 1 multiverse is the idea of an infinite single universe, or at least very large. The minimum size, if our universe had, say, periodic boundary conditions, and that is that if I could stop the expansion of our universe and travel at the speed of light or faster, I expect that I would never come to the edge of our universe. But non-trivial topologies, geometries, would actually allow for periodic boundary conditions, much like a cylinder. That if I start going in one direction, I might actually end up back where I started. But for that not to have already been detected by now, says that the distance that I would travel, I would have to travel to come back to where I started, would have to be at least on the order of about 80 billion light years. So it's either something at least 80 billion for our universe or infinite. It either has periodic boundary conditions or non-periodic. And this would define a level 1 multiverse of his. Level 2 multiverse is one in which there is a set of sometimes what are called meta-laws. Like in my area of string theory, there's an underlying mathematical equation that any universe that exists has to follow. But there is more than one mathematical solution to this meta-law. And that in this space-time soup that allows universes to spew up, to bubble up, each universe that bubbles up doesn't have to have the same set of physical laws, but each physical law has to obey the underlying meta-law. And in string theory, that you typically hear the number 10 to the 500. That's the number of string universes, the order of the number of string universes that can obey this meta-law of string theory. But they have each 10 to the 500 universes would vary somehow in their physical laws. They might not have electromagnetics or strong or nuclear forces. They might have some other type or combination or number of physical laws. But the set and the physics of that particular universe, or this one over here or that one here, all satisfy the underlying meta-law. That's a level 2 multiverse. Level 3 multiverse is one that's also known as Hugh Everett universe. This was a type of multiverse thrown in by philosophers, Hugh Everett in particular, that says that choice occurs, and any time that a decision is made, either conscious or by nature itself, that a given universe is going to split up into all of the different possibilities based on the choices. And basically, it's a quantum mechanical effect. So the analogy is if I had a quantum dice, six-sided, and I threw it up and let it roll and land here, it could land in any of six different face values showing up. And Hugh Everett universes, our universe here would split into six different ones. Each of us would be reproduced in each of one, and we would see one particular result here. And that's Hugh Everett level 3 multiverse. Level 4 multiverse is basically the multiverse of multiverses. It's the complete set of any possible mathematical structures. These mathematical structures could be inconsistent with each other, but each of them can produce their own meta law and their own vast number of universes. But in some sense, they cannot physically exist together, but they can exist physically separate in reality as a whole. And those are how, and you can't have anything beyond a level 4 theoretically, because that is everything of everything. So he created this just for that point. That level 1 is the simplest. It's a vast extension or infinite extension of a single universe, and 4 is the collection of all possible collections of universes. And so I focus mostly as a cosmologist on level 1 and level 2 in particular, a vast collection of universes that all satisfy some underlying meta law such as string theory. And there's other alternatives to that too, not as dominant as strings. But what I've done in my paper is to try to deal with and examine some of the theological issues that one or more of those multiverses bring up. And again, focusing on level 1, 2, and some other physicists have dealt with level 3. Don Page in particular, a colleague of who's written, he's an evangelical Christian, and he's written several papers with Stephen Hawking. And he's examined the implications of a level 3 multiverse, the quantum mechanical Hugh Everett possibility. And in each of those, level 1, level 2, level 3, and sometimes level 4, one can examine what does this imply about how God may interact with his creation. And there's different implications for each different level. But one of the main things I examined in the paper was if we picture God as creator of the multiverse as a whole, how can we see God and how can we interpret God as interacting within a given individual universe? And what does that mean if we assume level 1, level 2, or level 3? Especially in particular, God interacting with Hugh Everett universes. And that was one of the more interesting for me to examine and discuss Don Page's interpretation. And Don Page versus some of the others will say we can see God interacting in terms of which quantum mechanical choices God may not allow because they could yield, say, too much violence versus Bob Mann in Canada at Waterloo demands that. He cannot see God allowing all possible choices because that would yield too much evil. So he sees God imposing constraints there on this universe has this quantum mechanical possibility has too much violence. It passed some numeric limit versus these don't. We can allow a Hitler-like being, but we can't allow 100 of them. But whereas Don Page says, God loves the beauty of these vast systems, and God may allow all possibilities because for him, the mathematics and the beauty of the whole system is a greater value than not allowing the whole set. So he poses that as an alternative for what would have the mark of God, what would have God's blessing, either everything or unlimited value. And this has posed quite a bit of debate in papers from the cosmologist and theologian view. I tried to summarize that in the paper, the different views that we can have. I think that gives a pretty good summary of what I did and what I tried to write on, and I think I will stop there.
I love this slide, so I'm just going to leave this up here in my response. Issues like these tend to raise more questions for me than answers. And so I will offer a few of them as a response, which is coming not from a cosmologist or a theologian, but an engineer. And so I hope some of these questions provide additional access points to this fascinating topic. The first, what's my test to attribute faith to experts on scientific matters? And if I'm honest with myself, it's not very consistent. I think the example that first comes to mind is here in Chicago, we have tons of skyscrapers, right? If you've ever gone in a building greater than 5 stories, there's a smoke exhaust system to protect you in the event of a fire, right? I think most people probably don't even think about that at all. And last November, there was a fire in the Hancock building downtown, which many of you might have gone to the observatory there. Their system is so outdated, it still corresponds and satisfies the Chicago code, but any smoke expert would tell you, under the right conditions, smoke isn't going to go anywhere in this space, and it's going to cause danger to occupants, right? So I think we could all probably list tons of examples where we don't even think about the science required to protect us or to enable us to use devices or make other decisions. But when it comes to other areas, right, in a topic where I think most people probably don't fully understand the science, we make pretty strong decisions without a consistent test of when we defer to experts outside of our own expertise. The second is, what's our role in determining existence? In the paper, Professor Cleaver goes into a little more discussion about a positivist theory, and must we observe something for it to exist? And how does our answer to that question honor God as our creator and ourselves as being part of the creation? I think is an important point to consider. And even in science disciplines, for the longest time, women and men have theorized beyond what's contemporarily observable, right? And I think in those times, the theories are not just dismissed as bad science or as just philosophy, but are honored as scientific theories. And I think one of the more recent ones that was in the headlines recently was Einstein's prediction of gravitational waves in his theory of general relativity, right? That for decades after his theory, there really was no experimental evidence, and then there was some evidence, and then just last year, right, we actually observed these and made huge headlines. Another question, how has God's omni-qualities, which Professor Cleaver refers to in his paper, baffled humans before, right? God in some ways is unknowable, right? He's infinitely creative. His scale is beyond what we can comprehend, right? His omniscience, all these omni-qualities. And the one that comes to mind for me that I love as I've studied history more is human understanding of the seas, right? For the longest times, they kind of embodied chaos, the unknowable, right? Like just grave danger. And to see where we are now in understanding how oceans behave and how water moves and how we can model that is fascinating for me. And so thinking about this topic, which I don't understand very well, I think is a huge testament to these omni-qualities of God. Might we look back in a few centuries and see ourselves today as people looking back at those who observed the seas as just chaos that are unknowable depths? Another question is, how has human recklessness undermined God? Professor Cleaver in his paper presents a few counter-arguments to multiverses, right? And one of them is that, people are just being reckless. We're not treating this with objective science, right? If we acknowledge we can't observe it, why is it even a scientific issue at all? I think to answer this question fully, we'd all need our collective years of lives to try to answer how have we been reckless and how has that undermined God. We probably wouldn't even scratch the surface on that. And so for An example of this, actually, the story of the golden calf comes to mind, right? Where, right out of Exodus 31, come make us gods who will go before us. This fellow Moses brought us out of Egypt. We don't know what has happened to him, right? And I think very clearly, right, there was clear recklessness there in kind of overstepping what we as humans can do. And so I think considering that question, it's important when we think about what's cutting edge in science and technology and other areas. Are we really being reckless? And from the little I know about multiverses, I think we have slightly different motives in exploring them, and they are treated with a bit more care than those who created the golden calf. But again, that's just my observation. Another question is, how have false dichotomies misinformed beliefs? Again, in the paper, Professor Cleaver mentions how atheists have set up this false dichotomy between God and multiverses, right? That God isn't needed if there are all these bubbles boiling in this pot, right? There's no purpose for him. And then explains how that, in his view, is a false dichotomy. And I just imagine how many people, when hearing these arguments put out, think, well, I know God exists, therefore multiverses must not exist, right? I have to imagine a fair number of people do, and I think similarly for some of the other scientific principles that are very commonly accepted in scientific communities, right, like evolution, Big Bang, age of the world. I think some of these false dichotomies mislead a lot of people. And another one, just from my own area in the built environment, is how we view bacteria, oddly enough, right? For decades, since the development of antibiotics, we've kind of treated so many surfaces, environments, our bodies with these bacteria-killing agents that we've just wiped so many bacteria out. And more recently, we understand, right, our bodies are made up of so much bacteria. Our environments have so much bacteria, right? More bacteria than there are stars in the galaxy, right? And of those, about 100 or so are harmful, right? So you think about the order of magnitude of what we're killing with all these antibiotics and the harm that it's done. So Jack Gilbert here in Chicago at Argonne and UC does a lot of work on this. And, so I think there are tons of other ways that we set up these false dichotomies that really misinform our beliefs. And I wonder how that might affect this scenario as well. Adding a little more kind of poll data to Professor Cleaver's, an October 2015 Pew poll found that 59% of US adults said science and religion are often in conflict. 76% of adults not affiliated with the religious tradition said they're often in conflict. Right, and so again, I think, as he mentioned, this whole this battle between faith and science, right, that's really cropped up in the past 120 or so years, I think has done a lot in informing our understanding of their relationship. And so it's a blessing, I think, to have a forum like this to discuss these issues and just to take the time to really get into them. Another question. What scale do we use when comparing ourselves to God? Right? Is it the number of stars in the sky? Grains of sand? I think thinking about the magnitude of multiverses, right? Especially once you get to, say, like the level 4 multiverse, right? It's something that's just totally incomprehensible to me. When we talk about them, and I understand, okay, whatever, billions of trillions, whatever, but really it loses scale. And I think in some way that's glorifying God, right? That there are parts of creation that we are beginning to understand that put us in such a small place compared to the grandeur of God and his creation. And so in that way, it's very edifying, I think. And my last question is, how do presuppositions tint our observations of nature? In the paper, he mentions, two camps basically using Occam's razor to argue for and against multiverses, right? That the presuppositions we bring to that argument are really tinting how we approach it. And similarly, that multiverses can strengthen one's understanding of God, but also undermine it, right? That, hey, we don't need it if all these bubbles are boiling in this planetary soup. And again, I think there are lots of examples of how presuppositions tint our observations of nature. The one that came most to mind for me is Galileo's observations of the moon, right? So in 1609, 1610, took a telescope and pointed it up at the moon. And for the longest time, people thought that all the bodies in the heavens were perfectly spherical, right? And that, if the next time you can see the moon at night, go out and just look at it, right? You can see spots very clearly. And, people had reasoned those away as differences in density or what they called rarity of the material, or the light reflected differently off them, but the moon itself had to be spherical. And as he looked up there and saw, right, it was very clear that there were these crevices and caverns, and that depending on where the moon was in relation to the sun, right, those appeared differently. And he would even have people come and look through his telescope, and they wouldn't believe it. And so he'd say, well, go look at the ships. You can see the ships with your naked eye. Look at it through the telescope. Like, this isn't just a magic device, right? But again, these presuppositions are very strong. And in a letter actually to Kepler in 1610 of August, right? So just a few months after publishing this pretty controversial piece, he said this: "What do you have to say about the principal philosophers of this academy, who are filled with the stubbornness of an asp, and do not want to look at either the planets, the moon, or the telescope, even though I have freely and deliberately offered them the opportunity 1,000 times? Truly, just as the asp stops its ears, so do these philosophers shut their eyes to the light of truth." Right? And even after that, there are other letters of people saying, it's really the rarity, it's really the density. This has to be a perfect sphere, even after people have looked at it. And so, again, I think we should recognize our presuppositions as we come to observe nature, because they clearly do influence how we understand what we see. And in this case, what we don't see, or what we think can be argued based on what we understand about our universe. So I'm sure there are many other questions and comments and discussion, so I look forward to the ensuing discussion.
We have our full We have our full 50 minutes for discussion. We'll begin. We'll allow Professor Cleaver to begin with a response and then open it up for questions, reminding those who are online to sign in or log in to be able to join the discussion.
Thank you, Stephen, for all the points you raised. I think they're all very good, and I agree with what you're asking. I think this is a topic that brings a lot of questions, and it raises more questions than I think at present we can answer. So I'm not going to try to answer any of them. I'm not able to. So I will leave them to the audience to discuss. And if any of you have the answers, please tell me.
All right. Fair enough. Okay, Tyler will take the microphone. Please do speak into the microphone so that those online can hear.
Hi, thanks very much to both of you. And I want to ask if you can reflect, both of you, on unpacking the first question raised in the response. And I'm probably going to get it wrong, but it went something like, how do we attribute faith to a scientific expert, or something like that, along those lines? What does that mean for the respondent, and for Jerry, what do you take that to mean, and why is that a critical question for this engagement?
First off, I would suggest that taking simply by faith what a scientist tells you should be something very difficult and only rarely done. I think scientists, it's our duty and responsibility to convince you through logical, scientific argument in a clear, understandable way what we're trying to say, and not just leaving it up to faith. I'd say that's one of the differences between theological faith assumptions we need to make and science that we're trying to claim. There is always going to be some level of faith. We ourselves are having to have faith beliefs in the research that we're doing, and that there is something beyond the observable, and that itself is faith. But in terms of what we're trying to tell the general community, take everything scientists say with a grain of salt.
I think an important part for me is one, just the observability of a claim, right, or the repeatability of it, right? So I never think twice about sitting in a chair about how it's going to support my weight, right, and that it's stable enough so that I can move around. But I do, and every time I've sat down, it's been fine, right? I think in matters like this, it's much harder to do that. And similarly with like a smoke system in a building, right? Like unless you've been in a fire in a similar building, it's hard to have that type of experience. I think it's important to recognize, the motivations behind scientists, right? I've seen some reports of, I think there were a few scientists back in the maybe 50s or 60s who were paid by the sugar industry to present evidence against sugar, right? And now I think a lot of science requires, disclaiming your funding sources, right? And so looking for those types of motivations, I think it's something to consider. Not that those override sound science, but in an area where the science isn't quite as sound or it's a little more aggressive, I think recognizing those potential biases is important. At the end of the day, though, I think there's just for me personally, I think there are too many things that I interact with on a daily basis that I don't fully understand, right? And so I just basically trust that they are going to work as they're intended to. Right? I couldn't sit here and fully explain to you evolution, but I believe that's what God's used to develop creation. And so some of it I think is looking to a broader community and looking for the built-up trust and establishment in that community, and just attributing some faith to, hey, this community of cosmologists has spent so much time on this, and some of it goes to that too.
I think you have a good point. There's a difference between the claims of an individual scientist and what the scientific community has come to accept as valid after open discussion, comparison, and analysis. I mean, it's much harder for one scientist to get bad data or bad theories through the scientific community as a whole. When the comments I was making them with regard to more the individual scientist.
Did you have a question?
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question based on some things you've written previously that I didn't see in this paper, but I think would be helpful for the discussion. So can you say a bit about Borde-Blanken-Guth theorem as relates to the beginning of the multiverse?
Yes, this group of people, interestingly, two of those people were some of the original founders, Guth and Blanken, of inflation theory itself. But in around 2003, they presented their first paper arguing that when one traces back anything that has gone through an inflation process, it appears that there is an earliest time for that space-time region. And this says that everything ultimately appears to have a beginning. And that is based, and the one assumption is that the average growth of that space-time region is positive. So that allows some exceptions to their rule, but which I'll get to in a second. But basically, it is they themselves argue that going back, projecting an infinitely backset origin of something doesn't work. that there has to be a finite beginning of any spatial region. And that says even like a multiverse as a whole had to have some starting point. Now what they mean by that, there's one exception, or I need to clarify. It's not that the multiverse simply popped into existence, as in God said, let there be a multiverse, and there was. But the scientific understanding is that multiverse to go into its inflating, growth, expanding stage at some finite time in the past had to go through some phase transition in scientific language. And that is the general conclusion of their paper. As some people have pointed out, there is an exception to that, and that is if one has a cyclical universe or multiverse. And that is a universe that goes through an expansion stage, can stop, and then go through a compactification stage, basically like an accordion back and forth, forward, expanding, shrinking, expanding, shrinking. Models like that are possible. That's the one exception to their paper, to their whole series. They've narrowed down their arguments and eliminated caveats over a series of papers from 2003 with that one exception. And they've acknowledged that you have a cyclical universe, and there are proposals for that. That escapes their bounds. That could be going on for infinity, just in and out, fluctuating, like that. But that's what their theorem says.
Larry Camphausen, and thank you both. My question is, I guess, I feel like this discussion is pretty abstract and not really connected to the biblical story or the story of God's interaction with creation, which from a ecclesial point of view, from the church Christian story, is one about God's relationship to our universe and specifically human beings. So how does this, the multiverse or these various, so our story begins with the first paradigm view. So there's some translation I would expect needed. So how do we tell the story that began in a three-tier universe in the current cosmologies?
I can take a stab. Like I said, I'm no cosmologist or no theologian. My understanding is that what's being proposed, I think, with the idea of a multiverse is that God's work in creation was through multiverses, like a tool really to get to the story that we see in Genesis. And in a similar way, I personally believe that God used evolution in a way to create man and woman and to create the creatures of the earth and the sea as described in Genesis 1. I think, this idea of multiverse and physics behind that is just another tool to create the stars and the earth and the sky and everything else. So said simply, is that.
Yeah, and I would say again, I think what we're understanding when it comes to three-tier structure, to me that is a human being derived view. And it was growing understanding with each paradigm shift. We saw reality better, more fully, more complete for what it really is. It's at each stage, the human view has been growing and developing. God has always been there. God is always there in the ultimate true view of creation. But we have been changing, growing, becoming more enlightened to the reality of God's creation.
Just add to that, a quote from his paper that I didn't mention in my response, but I loved, was, "Existence of God can never be argued away by the growth in human understanding of physical laws of a universe or multiverse. Rather, gains in human understanding of nature can expand our understanding of the creative methods of God." And I think that ties nicely into his response.
I've seen Hans and then, Susan and Jonathan and Ian and Max. We'll take that order.
Do you want me to go ahead? Oh, okay. I guess I have the mic. I was really interested by the language of choice and the level 3 universe, and then also in your comments about what choices, quote, what choices God would allow. Whose choices are we talking about here? I mean, I'm just a little confused by this language of choice in this kind of context. I'd love to understand more.
One is, I apply the term choice, but I'm talking about both conscious choices of people and also choices of outcomes in nature. Both. I should distinguish, but to combine them together, I use choice to indicate both of those possibilities. Conscious choice or choices within the natural world, the non-sentient world.
Choices should really mean variation.
Options, yes, options.
Not agencies.
I'm saying both. I use it to generalize both things. Choices consciously made by sentient beings and options that could occur within natural non-sentient events. Rolling of a dice or deciding me rather going out that exit or that one. Either of those would fit into these choices. So in the level 3 multiverse, there are some splits where I choose that door, some where I choose that door. There are also ones where a raindrop lands outside that window, or another one where the same one by a quantum effect goes over there.
Yeah, I just had a question just about the argument, the logic of a point you made in the paper, and it just for my clarification, and it could be that Joshua's question, what you guys were talking about answers my question, but it's just a problem of infinite regress. So it seemed like you were saying if the origin of this universe is a Big Bang, and that poses a problem, the multiverse gives an answer to that question. So then, I guess, then why wouldn't there be so that's multiverse with a little m. So why wouldn't we posit a multiverse with a big M to explain the multiverse and then keep going that way? I wasn't sure where that would stop, the logic of that.
The logic
From,
of that.
yeah.
The logic of that stops at Max Tegmark's multiverse level 4. That is it. There's no level 5 multiverse because the level 4 is the complete set of everything. So the question then is, why level 4 multiverse? You stop right there, and it's a big why, even if it goes that far.
John, student. So just to jump into level 3, I guess level 2, level 3 multiverse with aspects of choice. Free will particularly poses a problem, I think. Particularly, I don't understand string theory, so you could probably just throw the book at me on this one and sit me down. But when I think about chaos, there is potentially an infinite number of outcomes because of quantum mechanics. The raindrop can fall basically anywhere. You let the air out of the balloon, it can go anywhere. You can't predict where it's going to go. But when we start talking about infinite multiverses with potentially similar or same meta law underlying, and then the sample size is so large that you get repeat, right? So the balloon, if you release the balloon 10 to the 500th power times, eventually one of those times it'll probably fly the same path. So if we're having the same outcomes and the same choices being made, the die is landing on 6 however many times because that's what my niece has in Candyland and she just runs around the board. It seems like that just happens every time, right? If the dice keeps landing on 6 and the choice keeps being made, then what agency do I have to make choices if in other multiverses my doppelganger is making the same choice repeatedly?
That is a good question, and that is one of the criticisms that has been made. And it actually goes so far on Max Tegmark's computations. He argues that, and makes the point that if our universe is in fact infinite in size, if any universe is infinite in size, where there are a fixed set of physical laws, and at the same time, there's only a finite number of ways of distributing a given set of particles. Then if you can actually compute, as he does, how far distance-wise in a single infinite universe you would have to go to have a high probability of finding the same object physically identical. So he actually computes the expectation value on how far away in our own universe we would need to go to find a galaxy that looks just like ours. Or a galaxy that works just like ours, how far away to find a solar system that looks just like ours. That's clearly going to have to be further. The more detailed you get, the further away you have to go. But he's computed he's estimated the probabilities to how far away to find your own doppelganger that either looks exactly like you, which has approached zero probability, but somewhere in, say, you sitting down and not asking that question during this talk, or you wearing a red shirt and asking the question. You can find out, he estimates those probabilities. So those things already occur even in a multiverse level 1.
So do we still have agency?
I've raised the point in my discussion a little bit is, the analogy to me becomes, let's say you were born with a twin. And up until leaving your mother's womb, you were physically identical. What is your agency versus your twins? Now let's go one step further. It wasn't twins, but triplets, or ultimately quintuplets, or septuplets, and all that. How many would it take for you to feel that you don't have free will? Exactly. Yeah, but see, yeah, I'm just saying. To me, that's the only. That was the issue I could think of. Does having doppelgangers remove your free will? Does it remove your responsibility? I don't think so. I think responsibility remains no matter how many doppelgangers there might be. God gives responsibility to each of us, no matter what else might exist. That's the only thing I could conclude.
Just a quick addition. I think I agree that I don't think doppelgangers preclude agency, and that argument, I think, magnifies my understanding of God even more, right? That he knows us from the time we were conceived in our mother's womb. And even if there are an infinite number of people like me saying the exact same kind of thing, just imagine how many people God knows so intimately in these choices and in the lives that we have. And so another thought, not getting into the depths of arguments of free will, but I think does kind of magnify my understanding of how God really knows creation.
Right, next we have Dr. Proven, followed by Max or whoever's online, and then Tyler. And if there are others, just indicate.
Hi. At one level, of course, this is all good, clean fun, and it keeps us off the streets, as it were. As another level, I rather resonate with this gentleman's question about existential impact. And it relates to the broader question we're discussing, I think, in this symposium. And that, well, one of them is, how exactly are we supposed to negotiate this question of Bible reading on the one hand and being the ecclesial body, and then the weight or not that we give to scientific theory? So let me preface what I'm about to say by pointing out that the three-tier universe is an empirically based model. That is to say, it's what people saw. Mm-hmm. Right. So the Bible, I think, is very into empirical inquiry, and that's what marks it out from the Greek philosophical tradition, so far as I can see. So that's the preface. And then jumping a little bit from there, but I'll come back to it, the history of the engagement of Bible and science, I think, suggests at least two things. First of all, that we really ought to be open to new scientific inquiry, and that sometimes it's valuable and important and right to allow that to modify previous faulty interpretations of Scripture. And at the same time, it's also right to be cautious until theories have reached a certain weight, crossed a certain threshold of evidence, whereby the majority of scientists or whatever are saying, yes, we agree now that this is right. So both of those things are true. So now I'm asking, how much should I allow any of this to affect my daily life? Which I think is partly your question, and indeed my theology and my practice and everything else. So as I weigh up your paper insofar as I understood it, because of course, like most people in the room, there were many things there that were entirely beyond my ability to grasp. I mean, I find Schrodinger's cat that I'm happy to see or not see up there on the screen already baffling enough without all the rest of this. So as I add up the columns here, I have scripture that tells me that God is a creator, that God is not part of the cosmos. Indeed, this is a biblical distinctive over against ancient Near Eastern culture. So pantheism is out. I see scripture saying that God did in fact fine-tune this cosmos, and the ordering that we see around us is indeed God ordained, and that's why we flourish here, why other creatures flourish. In other words, the biblical view is consistent with what I see in the cosmos. It's still empirically based, in other words, right? So the biblical claims correlate to what I see in this universe, as far as I can grasp that. And then I have this other theorizing, which you yourself called speculative, I believe, at one point in the paper. You may want to repent of that, I don't know. Currently, without evidence, at least of the sort I can grasp, perhaps if I understand you correctly, never capable of empirical demonstration for all we know, and certainly that's most unlikely in my lifetime. So for all practical purposes, this seems to be something that I should be fairly cautious about. And in some versions of it in the paper, it involves claims about God really being pantheistic in nature after all. So then I add all of that up, and I think to myself, well, what am I supposed to do with that existentially? And I think the answer is it's all very interesting, but really it's of very little relevance to anything in the church or the world or my life at the present time. Perfectly interesting and possibly even correct for all I know, but I have a million more pressing things to worry about than the million doppelgangers that might be out there. Although you'll understand, being a fallen person, I think a million doppelgangers of me is a pretty good idea. And indeed, the idea that we would fundamentally change our view of God away from what is in scriptural revelation appears to be the whole ballgame. It's one thing to say we might adjust our views of the cosmos in terms of how it's constructed. It's another thing to say the Christian tradition has been fundamentally wrong all along about the nature of God and God's relationship to the world. So those are my concerns about it. I'm a curious person. One level I love it. I just don't know what I'm supposed to do with it. Or rather, I'm pretty sure what I'm supposed to do with it at the moment, actually, which is to say, that was fun. Now life goes on. So.
I think you raised valid points. I think you raised good ones. And I don't see it as altering our traditional Christian views. And the pantheistic part, I argue against that.
Yes, I know you do. I'm sorry.
I'm saying I'm saying I recognize that, and that's why I think the place where it pulls that in is what, given multiverse, what that would say about process and open theology. It turns process and open theology into a pantheistic view, because God is, as we understand it, God then becomes constrained to each individual universe, because all of the universes are acausal to each other. And so if you trap God within, as process or open theology does, it does imply that. Yeah, and that's why I disagree with that, with that concept of the process or open theology. What I think it does, what I do see about it is understanding it can give us, under the assumption of multiverse, and again, as a scientist, I never go past multiverse level 2, and understanding as an answer for the apparent fine-tuning otherwise required of the constants of nature in our universe. We can only, from the scientific view, it's either something like this, which still can be seen as God as creator of the multiverse, or God specifically choosing the fine constants, if it's the only universe, or they are unexplainable to the fine-tuning required through a scientific process. And I think this gives us a scientific process that also recognizes God as we would in standard Christian faith. What it does do is also gives an understanding of the process for God working in nature that CTNS promotes. And this we can relate it in this way in terms of God allowing or disallowing quantum mechanical choices. So that's where I think it works in.
Just a quick add-on to that ties back to the first question about how do we attribute faith to scientific experts. I think when those claims oppose other beliefs in God in particular, right? I think that raises a much higher standard, right? Given the built-up understanding of God through time, to have some claim out and say, hey, you really have to reconsider a fundamental aspect of God, requires a much higher bar. And in this case, I agree with Jerry that for me personally, my understanding of multiverse doesn't change God's fundamental identity in any way. Perhaps maybe just expanding an understanding of his creative capacities. But I think that's another important bar.
Okay, this is my question, and can I make one comment in response to Ian's a comment, and that's I do think the multiverse actually has a good pastoral segue to engage our culture, because I have two teenage sons. One's 18 and one's 15, and for the past 4 years, when it was family movie night, they would often pick a Marvel film. The Avengers, I think they're looking for, I want to see Snowden, they want to see the Doctor Strange movie that's coming up in November. And so in terms of popular culture, multiverse theory is actually quite engaging for a lot of young millennials and people in our congregations. And so what I found really helpful was now I can separate fact from fiction, or kind of good science from science fiction, and allow me to have a theological conversation on God as creator and how he works in our world. So I do think that, so I was very thankful, because now I can actually talk with my sons about the multiverse and talk about Everett universes and the kind of the popular spin on that we see in our movie and TV culture, and talk about level 1 and level 2 universes and engage them in that way. So thank you for that, just a comment. The question I had is, I'll preface it with one small note. In the 80s, early 90s, I was a product of kind of the apologetics movement. So you had More Than a Carpenter, Josh McDowell's books. You had people like J.P. Moreland at Biola. You had Geisler. You had a very popular speaker even today, Ravi Zacharias, taking what I would call the cosmological argument. And what they do is they look at the L1 level universe, and they say that in order for us to live in the universe that we are in, the observable universe, it took such a fine tuning that it points to the reality of a creator. So, and it was a convincing argument when you heard it, because we live in the universe that they were speaking of. And when they talk about the fine tuning that it takes to live in the universe environment that we are, it makes a compelling argument, at least for the possibility that there was a beginning and God created it. What I wanted to ask was, I was very intrigued by your idea that in order for the space soup to produce only one bubble, it requires such a fine tuning that I'm wondering if, as a parallel, that might be something to discuss, is it a possibility? Is there evidence that perhaps such a fine tuning took place, that while multiverse theory points to the possibility of multi-universes, God as creator decided to so fine tune the soup just to create one, and that's the one we're living in? Is there evidence for that? I think the dilemma is that this is all within the level of theory, whereas within the level 1 universe, we actually have our surroundings and people are going to be more convinced because they're living in the environment that past apologists have used as evidence for a creator. But this is a multiverse theory, and I don't see the possibility of multiverses, and I'm still trying to grasp the concept. So is that something you would embrace? Is there evidence that there are multi-universes, and therefore you don't think that such a fine-tuning takes place? I would like comments. And then this is also in regards to respondent. I don't want to create false polarities or so I'm actually quite open to the idea that there might be multi-universes, but I'm just wondering the possibility of the fine-tuning that you spoke of.
You raised very good points. Thanks. With regard to fine-tuning of a space-time foam or soup to just produce one universe, if it was God fine-tuning that, then I would probably just as suspect that it would be simpler for God to just yield a single universe without going through that process of space-time soup. You don't need it then. It's just the same as the Big Bang, God yielding a Big Bang inflation that produces just one. There'd be no way of really detecting any space-time soup surrounding our universe then, which as a whole it's very hard. It is possible for evidence within our universe of the space-time soup and existence of other universes. One of the possibilities for that has been and continues to be investigated is the possibility of circular or spherical patterns in the cosmic microwave background where at the very early onset, when our universe popped into existence, in a space-time soup, if there was another very close to it in the beginning, that they could have overlapped and there would be patterns showing up in the cosmic microwave background, circular or spherical in shape. There was thought to be one pattern like that before Planck in the WMAP results, and those were studied specifically for that. The patterns that were seen in WMAP did not appear in the more detailed Planck results, though. So that was dropped. There is a certain region that you probably heard about that appears to be much colder in temperature. It's a large volume of space-time in our universe, and there's some possibility that that could be a similar result, and that is being investigated. But yes, it would have to be something like that, an overall pattern. Or also possibly, again, it has to do with more detailed patterns in the cosmic microwave background, patterns of the frequency distribution of the CMB, referred to as non-Gaussian distributions, that could indicate early on collisions or our universe popping out of a prior universe through its own nucleation effect. And those things are being studied.
A mathematical construct in terms of the kind of the evidence that points to the reality of
these would be phenomenologically detected they would be if they exist. They could be detected in studies of the light energy distributions in the cosmic microwave background experimentally, a phenomenological effect. They have not been. That's what I'm saying. It was thought that there was some evidence back in the early 2000s from the WMAP mappings of the cosmic microwave background, but it disappeared with the more detailed.
You say that status quo is we're still looking for a phenomenon.
Yes, status quo. That one fell.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
So my name's Tyler Johnson. I'm a pastor in Iowa. I have a physics background, so I found your paper very interesting. And I want to start just by echoing pastoral response in that I meet with a skeptic every month and we talk about things, and he's really taken by the multiverse and he's read Tegmark, and so to be able to talk about a God that exists within the framework of a multiverse I would just, as a response to Dr. Proven and others, there is a missional, I think, evangelical pastoral component to this discussion that we're having, even if it doesn't change a lot of my theology or reading of the text or anything like that. My question had to do, or maybe I'll just frame it like this. I see what your paper doing is assuming the multiverse, and how do we then understand God within that? How does that enlarge in our view of God? And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more of what you wrote on pages dealing with the Tegmark or the Everett, the third level multiverse. Because the way I read it, at least from what you said, it seems as though he doesn't give us a big view of God. he gives us more of a smaller view of more of a pagan deity who's needs something from the creation, who's looking for beauty, who wants to be a god that needs to be enhanced by the beauty or goodness, and that's his primal, or the first cause for allowing different multiverses or different quantum effects to spawn new universes. Is that where he's going? Because it seems to me that approach would lead to a smaller picture of God, more in line with the pagan deities of the ancient Near East than the Christian God.
Don uses that as one possible explanation for theodicy. He was examining theodicy. Why does evil exist? And there have been some claims before that this universe exists, God allows it because it is the best of all possible universes. Clearly, it's not the best of all possible universes when one considers theodicy. And so his approach was to try to give some possible physics, cosmology explanation for theodicy. That it is, and the overall general view that it is better that God allows all possibilities of universes to exist than not all. And so it's purely from his attempts at theodicy.
We're going to go to Young Hee next as a student, and then Professor Lin.
Okay, so Professor Cleaver, isn't it true that multiverse, this whole concept, is based on entirely and completely assumption, and that means faith, just like any other religion. You have to believe in the first if and the following many ifs to believe in multiverse and expand this concept about multiverse, just like any other religion. But the thing is, we cannot break the radiation belt around the Earth. And if you cannot break it, nobody can verify this multiverse concept. And then how is it not different from daydreaming? Just like I daydream that if I'm 5 meters tall, I can paint the ceiling. And so, I mean, studying the future is okay, there is no harm. But the thing is, if you have to study something about multiverse, the first thing you have to study is how to break this radiation belt around the Earth. But as far as I know, there are not many people, if not none, who study that part, because probably they already know that they cannot do anything about it. So why would I waste my time and energy planning on design on the ceiling when I cannot even reach the ceiling in the first place? So it seems to me that there are already some scientists and some science come up with some kind of a scientific notion which is not different from religion, and then they claim that they can stand hand in hand with theology, or they can integrate with theology, or they can help theologians, but what they actually do is take our faith away from our Father, and to me, it is more convincing to have faith in our Father, because our Father is omnipotent and He never forsakes His children, and He's the maker of everything, including multiverse, if it is true. And all these graphics, that's just the computer-generated image. And so, well, that's my comment.
I agree with you. If a multiverse exists, I believe that God is creator of it, of the whole thing. And I'm not sure, I wasn't catching your point when you were talking about the radiation barrier around the Earth.
Have you heard of Ben Allen radiation?
Oh yes, but I mean we are able to penetrate it. We go through it. We've gone through it all the time.
No, where did you get that?
Oh,
Nobody can do that so far.
we've been to the moon. We've been to the moon and back. I mean we passed through that.
That is questionable. That is questionable. Scientific. There are a lot of controversy going on about that. There is no technology whatsoever you can break that Ben Allen radiation barrier.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's go on, because I think that's all I can answer on that one.
Okay, we'll have one more question, and that will be Johnny Lin. Is that, yeah. Young Hee was a student. We do have another student, and that's okay. Okay.
Thank you, Adam Barnett, student. I'm not proud of this opinion that I have from this quote on your paper. Christ's divine nature could unite with other incarnational forms elsewhere within a single universe or throughout a multiverse. To me, that feels like infidelity, because you think, no, Jesus is ours, God is ours, the Holy Spirit is ours. How do you justify that to a congregation? How do you teach that without humanity feeling like they're losing their uniqueness?
If there are other sentient beings in this universe in particular, I believe that God would want to interact with those too. I think that God is creator of all things. I do personally find it hard to believe that an infinite, omniscient God whose nature is to create, that God would be satisfied with creating only a finite number of beings on a finite planet. So personally, I do believe, I don't think they've been here on Earth. I don't think we will likely be able to communicate with them, but I believe that God has created life elsewhere through an evolutionary process within this universe, and very likely within our own Milky Way galaxy. And I believe that God would, if it's his nature to interact with creation, interact with those too. Like that article says, if we're Star Trek fans, the Klingons are definitely a fallen race. So that was why the article was entitled Christ to the Klingons in Christianity Today.
I lied. We actually have time for another, maybe more if they're brief. But Ryan, we're gonna have Ryan ask this question.
So in terms of the level 3 multiverse, first of all, when I first saw it, I found it kind of strange. I'm like, maybe we should just separate this by a large amount of numbers, maybe make it like a level 7 multiverse or just something crazy like that, because it seems so unique and different. But you did mention that, and maybe it was partially a joke, that they kind of threw this in for the philosophers out there. And I'm wondering how philosophers and scientists have interacted on this particular multiverse theory, and if so, has it been positive interaction, or has there been a lot of polemic and tension between scientists and philosophers? And if it's good, could that maybe offer some hope for how scientists and theologians and religious people in general can dialogue about topics like this?
Very good question, and it is debatable enough and controversial enough between science and philosophers that there was a conference held last December in Munich, Germany, at Ludwig Maximilian Institute there, based on one of their philosophers of science wrote a book on this topic about 2 years ago. And it raised the question of something like entitled "The Science of String Theory," and then sort of question mark. And it was asking these very questions: what is science? And that was the one question that was debated at this entire conference. It was about 400 people, and it was half physicists and half philosophers. And you might not be surprised they did not reach a conclusion to that question at the end. Yes.
As more theologians are receiving advanced degrees and going on to higher education, has that narrowed the gap between theology and science?
I don't see that, unfortunately, happening, mainly because of the lack of science and theological education of the general public. I think the next generation, especially the millennials, I think they are duly ignorant of both good theology and good science. It's on both sides.
All right, we'll actually let that be the final word. So please join me in thanking our speakers. Klein, are there any announcements? Coffee downstairs, return at 11.